Welcome to episode 35 of the Cycling Europe podcast. My name is Andrew P. Sykes. This episode of the podcast is going to span more than a century of European adventure, from two pioneers of long-distance cycling in the early 20th century to a plucky middle-aged northerner taking on the challenge of cycling the length of the Rhine in the 21st century. More of that later. Now, cast your minds back to the early summer of 2020. Many of us decided to adopt what became known as a lockdown project, and the lockdown project that I adopted was to spend time researching the lifetimes and, crucially, the cycling of a certain Maximilian J. St. George. I'm not going to say too much about Max's cycling story and the book that he subsequently wrote, because in a few moments you'll have the opportunity to listen to the first part of the podcast that I published in June 2020 that was dedicated to Max and his cycling trip. That will fill you in on most of the details. But basically, Max cycled 26,000 kilometres around Europe in 1908 and 1909, and in the process visited every European capital city of his day, with the exception of Petrograd, that's modern-day St. Petersburg, and Lisbon. He then wrote a book all about it called Travelling Light or Cycling Europe on 50 cents a day. One thing that I tried to do when researching the original podcast was to find some of Max's descendants, but I failed miserably. However, 6 months later, in December 2020, I received a message from a chap called Timothy St. George, and this is what he had to say. "Hi Andrew, I believe you produced a podcast recently about my grandfather, Maximilian J. St. George. It was fascinating. Thank you very much for sharing this story." I immediately emailed Tim back, and over the course of the next few months he was able to answer some of the questions that I had about Max's cycle and his life before and after his epic tour around Europe. He also introduced me to his older brother, George. But it didn't end there. In April of this year, 2021, I received another email. This time it was from a man called Juniper, who lives in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and this is what he had to say. "Hello Andrew, I'm delighted to have come across your website while doing some research for a project that I've been slowly working on for many years. Your work parallels much of mine. My great-grandfather, Varnum Parish, was a law student at Notre Dame University in Chicago with Max and did a subset of the European cycle tour with him, about 2,500 miles, from August the 5th to November 29th, 1908. Back to me. I'd actually forgotten that for about 2 months Max did have a travelling companion, and he does mention Varnum in his book. But the story was about to get even better, as Juniper explained. "I have the detailed day-by-day diaries of my great-grandfather's trip, and intend to reproduce the voyage myself." I couldn't really believe what I was reading. Juniper also sent me a couple of pictures, one of an old trunk in which he'd discovered the diaries, and the second of a bundle of the diaries themselves. The story of Maximilian J. St. George, and now that of his travelling companion, Varnum Parish, was entering the realms of an Indiana Jones movie. Kind of. It was time to get Tim, George and Juniper together for a discussion, so, a few weeks ago, across 4 time zones, we did just that. And in this episode of the Cycling Europe podcast, you'll be able to listen to the conversation that we had. But at this point, you have to make a decision. You've got a choice of 3 things that you can do. Well, 4 if you decide just to switch off. But let's stick to the 3 that assume you're still gripped by the story of Maximilian J. St. George. If you want to feel fully informed about Max's story, stop listening to this episode of the podcast, for the moment at least, and go back and listen to episode 21 that was published back in June of 2020. Aside from telling the story of Max and his cycle around Europe, I spoke to the historian Dr. James Stout about the challenges of travelling in pre-World War I Europe, the writer and journalist Michael Hutchinson about the bicycles that Max and Varnum might have used, and 2 Romanian cyclists, Lehel and Elod, who in 2020 set off on their own epic cycle tour of Europe, travelling over 30,000 kilometres and visiting almost every country on the continent, eclipsing even the feat of Maximilian J. St. George over 100 years previously. So that's option 1. Option 2 is to do nothing and continue listening to this episode of the podcast, as you're about to hear an extract from episode 21, which basically fills you in on the backstory of Max and his travels. If you've only recently listened to episode 21 of the podcast, however, option 3 is the one for you, and that's to skip ahead by about 23 minutes to get to the first part of my chat with Max's grandsons and Varnum's great-grandson. The monologue, which in this episode of the podcast comes from Simon Garland, who talks about his cycle along the Rhine in 2019, is sandwiched in between the two parts of my conversation with Tim, George and Juniper. So make your decision now. If you've gone for option 2, you'll still be listening, and as explained, we're going to go back in time to June 2020 to listen to the story of Max and how I discovered it. Max's cycling story starts at the beginning of the 20th century. My knowledge of him, however, is much more recent and started when, in May 2013, I received an email from a chap called Angelo in America. Angelo explained how he had received a copy of my first book, Crossing Europe, about my cycle from southern England to southern Italy, for his 66th birthday, and had thoroughly enjoyed reading it. He went on to explain that he had always wanted to complete a long cycling tour of Europe and cited a book published in 1922 called Travelling Light, or Cycling Europe on 50 cents a day. My attention was immediately drawn to the use of the expression Cycling Europe. By that point, I had become Mr. Cycling Europe on social media and on my website, cyclingeurope.org. It seemed almost anachronistic that the same expression should be used within the title of a book from the 1920s. Angelo continued as follows, and here I'm quoting directly from his words in that original email. The author Maximilian J. St. George was a young American recently graduated from law school at Notre Dame in Indiana. Before embarking on his career, he went off on a 16-month cycling tour of Europe. This was around 1920. Total mileage was 16,300 miles. The condition he placed upon himself was that he would not stay in any hotels, rather, he would ask locals if he could stay in a barn or some form of shelter. He wanted to meet the people of Europe face to face. Often he was invited to stay in their home. He passed through every European capital except Lisbon and Petrograd. End quote. Petrograd is the city that we now call St. Petersburg. Angelo went on to say that he would love to follow Max's general route through Europe, but finishing Conversano in southern Italy, the place from where his own parents had emigrated to America. I've tried to contact Angelo for an update, but haven't heard anything back from him, so I'm not sure if he ever did set off in the tyre tracks of Max or not. If you're listening to this, Angelo, I'd love to know. At the time, I posted the details about Maximilian J. St. George, his journey and his book to my website. I did a little bit of research about Max, but could only find out that he had been born in 1885 and that later in life he'd become a successful attorney, making his name in the Great Sedition Trial of 1944. I looked online for a copy of his book, but no luck. I remember thinking that it would be nice come 2020, 100 years after Angelo said he'd set off, to do something in Max's honour, perhaps even try and recreate his long journey across Europe. In the summer of 2013 I set off on a second long cycle, this time from southern Greece to southern Portugal, and subsequently wrote my second book, Along the Med. Then, in 2014, I decided that there was at least one more long European cycle in me, and I came up with the idea of cycling from the southernmost point of Europe at Tarifa in Spain to the northernmost point at Nordkapp in Norway. I was working as a secondary school teacher at the time in Oxfordshire. The previous 2 European cycles had been squeezed into the long summer holidays. That wasn't going to be possible, bearing in mind the length of the third proposed journey, which I estimated to be around 7,500 kilometres. I made the decision to leave my job in December 2014, move back up to Yorkshire, the area where I was born and brought up, and then head off down to Spain in the early spring of 2015. The book about that journey, Spain to Norway, was published in 2017, and in a few moments I'm going to be reading a short extract. The context of that extract is as follows. I was cycling along the west coast of Sweden, and I'd repeatedly met a German cyclist called Manfred, although in the book, to save his blushes, should he ever read it, I referred to him as Helmut. Manfred/Helmut seemed to put a negative spin on everything, and each time we met over the course of perhaps a week, my heart sank a little further. Here's the extract. The words of Manfred are read by my good friend from Stuttgart, Klaus.
Norway is too hilly. The roads are bad and the weather is awful,
he moaned before getting his teeth into the Swedes.
They are poor cyclists. Their bikes only have 3 gears and you will never find a bike shop to repair your bike properly.
What had I done to have this man inflicted upon me? His oratory then took a surreal twist.
Cycle touring only became possible after 1990 when the technology allowed for proper gears to be used.
Did you say 1990, 1990? I questioned, checking he hadn't confused his numbers.
Yes, 1990. 1990.
I sensed he was annoyed at me questioning his facts. I was tempted to cite the case of an American Maximilian J. St. George who, in the years following the First World War, embarked upon a 26,000-kilometre bicycle tour of Europe. He ventured to most parts of the continent and upon his return to the US wrote a book entitled Travelling Light or Cycling Europe on 50 cents a day. I tried but failed to find a copy, but mentioned Maximilian, his adventure, and his book on my website shortly before setting off to cycle from Greece to Portugal in 2013. Then, on the day I left my job as a teacher in Henley-on-Thames, my colleagues presented me with a package wrapped in tissue paper. Carefully unfolding the wrapping, I found a copy of the book. It was a touching moment. Indeed it was. One of my soon-to-be former teaching colleagues had gone to the trouble of finding the book that Angelo had mentioned, but that I hadn't been able to find. Before setting off to cycle from Spain to Norway, I read the book, and it was an interesting read. Again, in the back of my mind, I thought how nice it would be to mark the centenary of Max's journey in 2020. Move on 5 years, and we're now in 2020, and in lockdown. So a few weeks ago, I picked up Travelling Light again and reread it, perhaps in more detail than I'd originally read it in early 2015. But there were 2 things that troubled me. Firstly, there was only one reference to the war. This was bizarre. In 1920, World War I, the war to end all wars, had only just finished. You'd think that it might have been something that any traveller through Europe would have remarked upon repeatedly, but he didn't. And when he did mention it, it wasn't by name, the Great War, it was just in an oblique comment about a conversation overheard in a train carriage. Here's the actor Jeremy Walker reading that short extract from Max's book.
The next morning, I tried in vain to secure a pass to Bordeaux, so I bought a ticket to Angoulême. The train was packed with soldiers. The main topic of conversation was the possibility of another war with Germany, and of course, that country's certain annihilation. But one fat old Frenchman, clad in the long black blouse so universal throughout the country, had grave doubts as to the latter point. The soldiers were indignant and would have nothing further to do with him.
We'll hear more extracts read by Jeremy later in the podcast. The other thing that Max never mentions, this time not once, is the so-called Spanish flu. This infected 1/3 of the world's population in 1918 and 1919 and killed many millions of people. So again, you'd think that a traveller through Europe in 1920 might have it playing on his mind. Not so Max, or if it was, he wasn't telling us. These 2 omissions were curious to say the very least. We know that the book was published in 1922 by Extension Press in Chicago and reprinted in 1923. It says so in the front of the book. But in the text itself, Maximilian never refers to the years in which he was travelling. It's an interesting observation that nowadays we're quite fixated with years. Many things are defined by the year in which they take place. London 2012, the Silver Jubilee of 1977, the general election of 2010, and of course the coronavirus pandemic of 2020. Most of the defining events of the 20th century, that we frequently refer to even now, the wars mainly, but also things like the 1966 World Cup final, if you're English, had yet to happen. Perhaps using years as place markers in time was a much less frequent trait in the first few years of last century compared to now. Max does refer to certain dates and months, so we know, for example, that he left his home in America on the 15th day of June. We also know that at the end of his trip, he caught the boat back to Boston on the 7th of September the following year. Angelo, in his email to me in 2013, had said Max's journey took place, quote, around 1920, end quote. Setting off on June 15th, 1920, if you're listening to this podcast on the day it's been published, that's 100 years ago today, returning home on September the 7th, 1921, writing a book, and then having it published in 1922, seems about right. But it isn't. And the clue as to when the journey did actually take place is in the short introduction written by a certain John Kavanagh. It's a clue that's easy to skip over, and I did twice. In the fifth of his 6 short paragraphs, he says the following. All this happened before the war. Could such an experience befall a pauper pilgrim now? International hatred and suspicion have changed much that was beautiful a decade ago, and it is to be feared that the slowest of reparations will be the restoration of that general international trust and charity manifested in this unpretentious recital of a pleasant pilgrimage among remote and unfamiliar peoples. Surely no one can read it without feeling how unreasonable and shameful, as well as unchristian, is hatred among nations. So there's the answer. Max never mentions the war or the Spanish flu because they hadn't yet taken place. He didn't cycle through Europe in 1920 and 1921, so when did he cycle? This is where I become detective. Kavanagh's introduction is dated November the 14th, 1922. He uses the expressions before the war and a decade ago, but they are rather vague. Any teacher worthy of their qualification knows that it's pointless telling a student that they have 5 minutes in which to do something, as 5 minutes never actually means 5 minutes. Similarly, a decade ago could be 8, 9, 10, 11, 12 years, perhaps even more. So we can't assume that Max set off in 1912, which is a good job because he didn't. In the last few weeks I've spent quite a few hours piecing together the life of Maximilian J. St. George and, crucially, that of his wife, Ape Lucia St. George. She was Italian, and that's important, but we'll come back to her in a few minutes. First, Max. He was born in 1885 in an area of eastern Germany that is now in southwestern Poland. His original name was Maximilian Juraszek. In April 1892, he emigrated to the United States with his family, initially to Texas. His formal education culminated at the Catholic College of Notre Dame in Indiana in 1908. He's now 22 years old and, with his qualifications to practice law acquired, free to travel. That said, he's no novice traveller, as he explains at the very start of the book.
I have always wanted to see Europe, said the editor of a Chicago daily paper. But the thought of the expenses held me back. It was this remark that inspired me to write an account of my experiences while cycling through Europe. By nature, I am of a roving disposition. Years ago, when I was a small lad, an old Negro woman, respected as the Sibyl of her people, told my mother that I would be a wanderer, and my youthful venturings seemed to bear her out. As the years passed, the wanderlust grew. I didn't even go home for my yearly holidays. I spent my vacations traveling. By the time I'd completed my university course, I'd seen practically all of the United States, Canada, Newfoundland, Mexico, Central America, parts of South America, Cuba, and the West Indies.
But as I've already pointed out, he doesn't tell us when he did set off cycling around Europe, whether it was just after he graduated from college or a few years later. His wife, Ape Lucia, as we've mentioned, is Italian. Max actually met Ape when he was cycling in Europe, and he talks about this in the book. But there are two versions of this romantic coupling. one in the book and another in a rather gushing syndicated newspaper article from 1913 entitled
How a Chicago Wandering Knight of the Bike Won an Italian Fairy Princess.
We actually learn much more from the newspaper article in 1913 than we do from Max's book, written in the early 1920s. The newspaper article kicks off with a quote.
You can't tell me that romance is dead, says Maximilian John St. George. And Maximilian knows what he's talking about, for he worked his way to Europe on a cattle boat, rode a bicycle 16,000 miles through strange lands on 40 cents a day, and won the heart of a rich and beautiful Italian noblewoman in her marble mansion on the Bay of Naples.
50 cents a day seems to have become 40 cents for the journalist, but that aside, we learn how Max pauses in Castellammare di Stabia to eat lunch and is surrounded by the curious locals, attracted by his foreign air. It's revealed that Max's future wife is in fact the daughter of a chevalier of the Italian crown, a certain Signor Quirico Manni.
He told them of his wanderings, and they listened as Desdemona listened to Othello. "Oh, I could love such a man," exclaimed Signorina Ape impulsively.
It's explained in the article how last year Max went back to Italy to see Ape and that on August 4th they will be married. The whole piece is complemented with a grainy photo of Ape doing her best to channel Princess Leia's hairstyle, decades before George Lucas imagined how it might be, and a bespectacled Max looking rather suave in a dinner jacket, bow tie and turned-up collar, looking like an aristocratic extra from Downton Abbey. There's even a cartoon of a man dressed head to toe in a checkered tweed suit on a bike. It's all very entertaining and very different from the style of the book. But it crucially gives us another date in our investigation, August the 4th, 1913. This matches the records that show both of them returning to the United States by boat from Naples to New York on August 30th of that year. But it also means that both 1913 and 1912 are out of contention for the years of Max's journey, as it seems unlikely that in 1912, the year that Max returned to Italy to propose, he would have travelled all the way back to Europe within weeks of his cycling trip finishing in the September. So we've narrowed things down to 1911 or before. But which year is it to be? Well, there's a mention in the listings of the Chicago Tribune about Max wanting to change his name on the roll of attorneys. He tried first in October 1910, but the request was denied. He tried again in October 1911 and, well, we don't know officially, but we can assume that that attempt was successful, as we now know him as Mr. St. George rather than Mr. Jurashek. So by the autumn of 1910, he had his mind back on the law. Seems unlikely that he would be doing all this administrative changing of his name while cycling across Europe, so we can now discount 1911. That change of name got me thinking, and following a search that included his original name provided the key to the mystery. On December the 5th, 1935, the Kerrville Mountain Sun in Texas published an article about the history of a local church called St. Mary's. The Jurashek family had connections with this church. Texas was, after all, the state to which the family had emigrated in 1892, and Max gets a passing mention when church renovations are being discussed. I quote, "The tile and mason contract went to Theodore Jurashek, whose brother, Maximilian, graduated from Notre Dame University and then with $250 and a bicycle travelled all over Europe for 16 months, wheeling 16,300 miles. On April 7th, 1909, he visited Father Kemper in Rome and borrowed his black suit to attend a papal audience." End quote. So there we have it. He was in Rome in April 1909, meaning that he started his journey in 1908, immediately after graduating from college. So if you are listening to this podcast on the date it's been published, June 15th, 2020, we're not marking the 100th anniversary of the departure of Max from Chicago on his epic cycle tour of Europe, but the 112th anniversary. Nowadays, cycle touring is a popular way to spend your holidays. Every year, thousands of Americans travel to Europe with their bikes for a few weeks, perhaps even for a few months of cycling. That wasn't the case back in 1908, and Max explains to us why he's chosen to cycle rather than use other methods of transport.
Like most people, I wanted to see Europe. To see not only tourist Europe, but the real Europe as well. By rail, I'd be whisked from one city to another and see nothing of the country between. Walking was too slow, in fact, out of the question because of the itinerary contemplated. An automobile was too expensive, a motorcycle too heavy, as well as unsatisfactory because of the speed at which one's tempted to ride. So there remained only the bicycle. On this, I determined to make the trip.
In terms of his route, it was a tortuous one to say the very least. He does tell us that he spent months planning the trip, but I do wonder if he dedicated much of that time to the twists and turns of the actual route he ended up cycling.
Arrived in London, I rode to Dover, where I crossed to the continent. With the exception of Lisbon and Petrograd, I saw every capital of Europe. In short, I cycled 6 times into Germany, 4 times into England, 3 times into Belgium, Holland, Austria, and France, through Denmark, Norway, Sweden, and Scotland, around Switzerland, Ireland, Spain, and Italy. The 16th month saw me again in London, after cycling 16,300 miles.
That's just a hint of the complexity. Fortunately, at the end of the book, in a 4-page appendix, he lists every town and city through which he passed. I'll spare you all the detail, but basically, and this is about as basic as I can make it, he set off from London immediately in the direction of the continent, taking the boat from Dover to Ostend, and then via Brussels and Amsterdam, cycled north towards Scandinavia, visiting his next 3 capitals, Copenhagen, Oslo, although at the time it was known as Christiania, and Stockholm. Another boat brought him back to Germany, where he ticked off Berlin. The area to the southeast of Berlin, as mentioned earlier, is where he was born and brought up, and he revisits it twice. On this first occasion, it leads him eventually to Prague and then Vienna, before continuing west to Bern in Switzerland, via southern Germany and Geneva. He now follows the Rhine north, as far as Cologne, before passing through Luxembourg and then, for the first time, into France and Paris. He's now heading south, and via Bordeaux, crosses into Spain on the Atlantic coast, before continuing to Madrid. At this point, he doesn't cycle to Lisbon, the capital of Portugal, which makes me wonder if it was ever his intention to pass through all the capitals in the first place, or whether it was something that he just happened to do inadvertently. So instead of Lisbon, he heads for the south coast and Cadiz. His journey now becomes very coastal, and he travels via Valencia to Barcelona, back into France, Marseille, Nice, and then into Italy to Rome, and south to Naples, where, as we know, he meets his future wife. He now starts cycling north, but on the Adriatic coast of Italy via Venice and Trieste, into what is now Slovenia and its capital Ljubljana, before Budapest and back towards his homeland in southern Poland. Continuing through the middle of Germany, he revisits Cologne and Brussels before catching a boat back to England via Calais. And he's not done yet. He has the capitals of the British Isles to visit, or most of them. After travelling along the south coast, through the Cotswolds and the English Midlands, he takes another boat from Holyhead on the Welsh island of Anglesey to Dublin before embarking upon a coastal cycle around the entire island of Ireland via Belfast, returning to Dublin for a boat to Liverpool. Travelling north, he cycles to Glasgow and takes a very scenic route to Edinburgh via Loch Lomond. The final leg of his 16,300-mile journey is through northern England via York and then Cambridge, back to Tilbury Docks and his ship home to America. That's a European cycle tour to beat most others. Welcome back to June 2021. As I explained earlier, I had made attempts to find the descendants of Max, but to no avail, so receiving the message from Tim, Max's grandson, who then introduced me to his older brother, George, and then to receive an email from Juniper, the great-grandson of Varnum, Max's travelling companion for a couple of months in 1908, was a real delight. A few weeks ago we met via Zoom, and I started by asking the three Americans to introduce themselves. The Twitter account that Tim refers to, by the way, is the one that I set up to help publicise the original podcast.
Hi, I'm Tim St. George. I live in Wheaton, Illinois, and I have two children. And my wife's Japanese from Japan, so I do speak Japanese, but not Italian.
Well, I'm George St. George, grandson of Maximilian. I'm the oldest remaining St. George in this clan, and I live just south of Houston.
My name's Juniper Hunter. My great-grandfather was Varnum Parish, my mother's mother's father, and the family from Momence, Illinois. I'm in New Mexico. I have three kids, two out of college, one still a freshman in college.
Okay, we're going to start with Tim and George. Obviously, you are brothers, and it was Tim who contacted me originally, out of the blue, really, a few months ago, doing research, presumably about your grandfather, Maximilian J. St. George, and you stumbled upon the fact that I'd also done a bit of research and I'd made the podcast that was originally published back in June of 2020. So let's kind of, first of all, delve into what you know, but perhaps what I don't. Did you ever meet your grandfather, Tim?
He died the year I was born, so I never really met him. And I learned about the podcast actually from one of my cousins in Italy, Carlo. And he's like, look what I found. And that's when I found like the Twitter account. I thought someone's hacked my grandfather. How could he possibly have a Twitter account? That's what spawned the interest. And I, obviously looked at your website and so on and contacted you that way.
George, am I right in thinking you're a little bit older than Tim? So the same question to you. Did you ever meet your grandfather, Maximilian J. St. George?
Well, I'm sure I sat on his lap sometime, but I was probably about 3 when he died, so I really don't have a remembrance of him. Most of the things I do recall were things that my grandmother would say because I spent a lot of time with her when I was growing up.
So just to clarify, George, what year did Max die?
I understand he died in 1959.
And what year did your grandmother die?
She died right before I went into graduate school. I think it was 1976.
Did either of you speak to your grandmother about Max's journey that he'd made cycling around Europe, Tim?
The only part of the story I know, of course, is the part that concerns her, that she's in the book and when he met her. I don't remember her speaking of that trip a whole lot. I knew that there was a book out there. I hadn't read it. I think I had seen a copy at one point at her house. Although she did speak of him a lot, I don't remember talking about the bike ride a whole lot. Maybe Michael does.
By the way, that's my middle name, so if Tim calls me Michael, you know who we're talking about. Yeah, I guess the same answer, basically. I do remember seeing a copy of the book, Cycling Europe on 50 cents a day, at my grandmother's. And I think she pointed out the parts, here's where, your grandfather met me and so on. But I don't recall, I don't think I read the whole book. And again, as my brother said, she didn't speak much about the trip. I mean, she'd speak more about stuff that happened in the intervening years.
You mentioned there that anybody who reads the book will discover the fact that Max and Lucia, they did meet each other while he was cycling around Europe. So it's almost strange that she didn't mention it a little bit more, because that important meeting took place during his cycle around Europe.
As Tim pointed out, it was the part that was important to her was the part where he met her, or perhaps the rest of it wasn't that keen, or she didn't really feel like delving into it.
What can you tell us about his life before the cycle around Europe? What were the circumstances of the family emigrating to America, if you know?
Well, actually, I mean, some of the things from your podcast were a revelation to me. I had assumed that after grandmother and grandfather met, that they moved to Chicago and basically lived there the whole time. I didn't realize that grandfather was actually lived in Texas for a large time. Now, I know we have second cousins living in the San Antonio area, some other Jurashiks. We even met a couple of them when they came up to visit in Chicago. But as far as when he was in Texas, presumably he went to Notre Dame while he was maybe still living in Texas and then took the cycling trip. anything happened before they got to Chicago, I was completely unaware of.
There was a number of Eurushics that had emigrated to the San Antonio region. And I guess there's a lot of from Silesia, which is the German-Polish border there, that went to that area of Texas, kind of a common theme in America, right? People from one area tend to migrate to a certain area in the United States. And actually, there's a gap in my mind a little bit too, because I think, I don't know why, but I thought that my father had said that he actually lived in Chicago, in the city of Chicago for a while before they moved up to Wilmette.
I think I make an error in the original podcast because I think I assume that the aristocratic side of the family was the side of your grandmother. Am I correct in thinking that actually Max's was also an aristocratic family?
There's some question about all of that. I know that the family folklore talks about him being a count and being titled and so on. I think if one were to go to the area that they came from in Silesia, that they owned a mill of some sort. I mean, it really wasn't necessarily aristocratic, and she brought most of that in. Juniper wants to chime in?
In Varnum's diaries, he does mention that he and Max go to visit a prince and the princess, and they're spending a lot of time with many of Max's relatives, some of whom clearly have affluence and some of whom are much lower income, if you will. So it looks like there's quite a diversity, but clearly they also do have access to people with some title.
Juniper, it might be a good idea for you to just now explain the connection between Max and Varnum, your great-grandfather, in a bit more detail. Can you explain how Varnum Parish comes into the whole story?
Varnum and Max both went to Notre Dame. I don't know the details of how they knew each other there, but again, Varnum lived south of the Chicago area in a small town. So evidently they became friends at Notre Dame and began the trip together after having graduated from Notre Dame. None of the living relatives that I've been able to speak to know much of anything about Max or remember him specifically. So I don't know, it's possible that some family letters come up that elucidate some of that, but at the moment, I don't think we really have a lot of details.
Varnum appears in the book for the first time when Max is visiting his birth town in Silesia, the border area with modern-day Poland and Germany. And Varnum joins Max for, is it 2 or 3 months until they get to Cologne, and then Varnum returns to the USA. Is that correct, Juniper?
Correct. It's from Tuesday, September 8th, 1908 to Saturday, November 7th, 1908.
And the reason why you are able to give such precise details there, can you explain why?
I'm coming from a very different end of the conversation as you all, since I inherited through my mom and through her mother, ultimately, the set of 4 diaries that Varnum had written as he did his own bike tour, a subset of which overlapped with Max. And so Varnum goes day by day, through every single day of his trip and has, details that are, a lot of parallel and analogous sorts of things that Max reports in the book. But it's the writing is the original daily writing as opposed to something compiled years later.
Tim?
Yeah, I think I mentioned this in a previous conversation too. It's interesting that they both took like cattle car trains to the east coast of the US. They both rode cattle ships across and worked on those ships. I mean, you just have to believe that all of this was cooked up in a dorm room at Notre Dame, a year earlier. And I don't know that they were on the ship together. I don't think so. There's just too many things in common there that you just know that was all had to have been planned. And, Max was probably saying, yeah, I've got lots of places we can crash, relatives in Silesia and stuff, meet me there. I've got family or something.
I would imagine it's Max who set off first. Is that right, Juniper?
Since Max doesn't actually give dates, I'm not entirely sure. I know the dates for when Varnum's voyage occurred, but they do mention the names of the ships, and they were on different ships, as it turns out. But Max doesn't give us enough information in the book directly to know that chronology. I could probably extrapolate backwards and maybe figure that out.
I agree with you completely. When I was doing the original research for the original podcast, it is a bit of a nightmare that Max seems to be very economical with his use of dates, years, months, specific days. And that was one of the big problems I had, was actually determine when exactly he set off and when he did the trip. But he says that he left his home in America on the 15th day of June, which I later worked out to be the 15th day of June in 1908. So he arrived, I think, in Europe around about, I think it was July time. And it's then that he set off on his epic tour of Europe. So how does that fit in with Varnum?
So I'll just ask again, you said June 15th, 1908, Max departed home?
Yeah.
Varnum left on September 5th, 1908.
So his trip around Europe was an epic trip by most definitions, but comparatively with Max's, it was actually quite short. Max returned to America on the 7th of September 1909. So he ended up traveling around Europe for, I think it was about 15, 16 months. Again, Varnum, when did he return to America?
November 29th, 1908.
So a much shorter trip, but still a sizable trip by any stretch of the imagination.
Correct. And there is some reason to believe, certainly that Varnum had intended to do a longer trip. Earlier on, he may have been in London on August 25th, 1908. He tried to get a pass extension for the following year. And, spoiler alert, the fact that Varnum's bike was stolen and he ended up having to leave early, indicates to me that they could potentially have planned to do a lot more of the trip together.
It's interesting looking at the sections of the book, of Max's book, where he is traveling with Varnum. I think it's fair to say that Max's book, Traveling Light or Cycling Europe on 50 Cents a Day, is quite a factual account of his journey around Europe. It's not a very emotive book. He doesn't really reveal much of his emotions. And it's easy to identify where Varnum turns up and when Varnum leaves, because he simply changes the pronoun from I to we after having introduced Varnum to begin with. And he also, towards the end, he does say something quite interesting just before Varnum leaves to go his own way, which is the only real indication as to what their relationship had been. And it's on page 151. He says, "It was just 2 months that we had been together. We had quarrelled with each other and made up, ate and slept together, and we had come to love each other as brothers. And so, although we might often meet again in America, the parting was hard." And that's the only real emotional aspect of their relationship. I would imagine if you were writing a book now, it would be very, very different.
Yeah, I guess it would depend on the person. Some people are more emotive than others. Maybe people do tend to express emotions more outwardly than they did at the time. I think that's probably just a part of, sort of culture, as culture has changed.
We'll come back to the diaries that Varnum wrote in a few minutes, but I just want to go back to Max and his life outside of the trip. Tim, what do you know about his life after he came back to America? What did he do and what did he become?
So I believe they got married somewhat, after he went back to Italy again, and then they were married, I believe, in Italy, and then came back to the United States. Like I said, I believe they moved to the south side of Chicago, and in those days it was a nicer part. And he started a law practice. He was, as far as I know, he was an independent lawyer. He had his own business. He was did trials, and then in the late 30s, early 40s, he became heavily involved with the Great Sedition Trial of 1942, which he wrote another book about. I'll just add, not nearly as interesting as Traveling Light, but interesting nonetheless. And I mean, it couldn't be two different kind of topics to talk about. And I know he developed Parkinson's later in life, And my dad actually was in practice with my grandfather for his last, I think my grandfather's maybe last 10 years or so. And he did die from Parkinson's, so from what I understand.
George, do you know of any existence of any diaries that Max wrote? Because it seems he must have written something down, like anybody who does a long trip and then subsequently writes a book about it, let alone a trip where it takes place in his case, 1908, 1909, and then he doesn't actually write the book until over 10 years later. The book was published in the early 1920s. It seems almost inconceivable that he didn't write any diaries. So the question is, do you know if those diaries exist?
I don't. One thing that's kind of been unfortunate with my family is we don't have a lot of records of earlier generations or even current generations. We don't have that many pictures of ourselves or videos, diaries, and so on. As you point out, it would be not unlikely that my grandfather did write something, but as far as where they might be, I've never heard mention of them. Not from my grandmother, and she would be the one to know, maybe my father, but he didn't say anything about it either. Now, to supplement something that my brother said, I do know that Granddad had Parkinson's at the end of his life, and so what little memory I have, and also the stories that I heard from my parents and my grandmother, is that he was very austere, a very serious person at that point, but that may have been one of the symptoms of his Parkinson's disease. He may have, been a lot more fun when he was just out of college than he was near the end of his life.
Are either of you aware of any trips that he did subsequent to the trip in 1908 and 1909? Because he does, at the beginning of the book, he does refer to having traveled quite widely, I think, in South America. So obviously he'd married an Italian woman, and he did come back and forth from Europe to obviously visit his wife's family. But did he ever embark on any other trips?
I don't believe so. And I actually don't think he even participated in the war.
One thing to add, I understand from some of the relatives I've spoken to that they were a little old to be in World War I. And I guess I understand indirectly that was something that my great grandfather, had felt like he wanted to contribute to the war, but was not able to because of his age. So I presume Max was about the same age.
I do remember there was a big Prussian helmet that was kept at my grandmother's place. It looked like, with the spike on the top and so on, which looked like something might have been from the World War I time period. Whether that was actually something that Granddad had during the war or whether it was just a collectible that he had. But
it could feasibly be that because of his Germanic heritage, he was simply kept away from being in the army for that particular reason. We're going to take a short break from the conversation with Tim, George and Juniper. And as they used to say on Monty Python...
And now for something completely different.
Well, it's not that different. It still involves cycling long distances in Europe, but it was a journey that took place 110 years after that of Max and Varnum. In episode 33 of the podcast, I chatted with Matt and Harriet Hall about their cycle along the Rhine and then the Danube to Istanbul. You can now see the second of their 3 planned videos, by the way, on YouTube. Simon Garland has also cycled along the Rhine, but his take on the whole adventure thing was slightly different, as he explains in this episode's Cycling Monologue.
Hello there. My name is Simon Garland. I'm 54 and live on the Wirral, Merseyside. Back in October 2019, I cycled EuroVelo 15 solo, back in those heady days where you could visit 7 different countries on one trip without being treated like Typhoid Mary. Episode 33 featured a great interview with Harriet and Matt Hall, who cycled EuroVelo 15 and sound like very competent and accomplished cyclists. In fact, all the podcast guests sound competent, hardy, and the sort of person you'd want at your side in a tight spot. I may be about to buck the trend. I'm pretty useless at bike maintenance. I like cycling and camping, but can't be bothered doing both. I'm in my 6th decade and left that nonsense behind. Attempting to sleep on a piece of foam laid across last season's unharvested turnips and lying awake trying to pick the uncooked bits of pasta from my teeth, listening to the earnest philosophy of the stoned students in the tent next door, is poor reward for 10 hours of exercise and lousy preparation for the next 10, to my mind. Don't judge me, and don't pick on people who pay to have someone carry their bags for them either. If your idea of real cycle touring is to make it as uncomfortable as possible, I'll guarantee there'll be someone looking down on you from a saddle made of sandpaper. And while we're here, don't get me started on wild camping, or as it's known to the rest of the world, trespassing. Maybe trying to sleep unwashed and illegally in a field full of weird animal noises while all your batteries die is your idea of fun. Me, this sort of thing turns cycling anecdotes into a two-wheeled version of the Four Yorkshiremen sketch. A tent, bloomin' luxury. We had to bivouac in a Kosovan minefield by a village overrun by wolves. That's real cycle touring, lad. Quite. So, back to EuroVelo 15. Preparation is the key, I'd say. I just wish I'd done some. Well, a bit more. For example, I was aware the Hoek van Holland metro wasn't working, but it helps to know if it's 20 kilometres or 20 miles from the ferry terminal to Rotterdam Central if you're hoping to catch a particular train. I didn't, and I didn't. However, while you're riding through one of the busiest ports in the world, here are a few things to look out for. The Rosenberg Wall is a windbreak for ships. It's made up of 125 concrete cylindrical slabs, each one 25 metres tall and 18 metres wide. It's an industrial photography student's wet dream. There's the Maesland Kering, which is a storm surge gate and one of the largest moving structures on Earth. And as you approach Rotterdam, you can cross under the river through the Maas Tunnel in a floor dedicated to cyclists. Top tip number 2 is to read what it says on your train ticket. A well-meaning fellow cyclist saw me preparing to get off at Basel and urged me to hang fire as the central station was a stop further on. It turned out that in fact Basel SBB was bad and Basel Bad was in fact good. I arrived in Andermatt 2 hours late and from a totally different direction. Tip number 3 is to pack some walking shoes and a hat. This was so I could visit Lake Thoma, the source of the Rhine, which is a 2-hour hike from Oberalp Pass. Where did I fit the walking shoes, you ask? Well, I wasn't carrying a tent, carry mat or frying pan. Fully laden, my panniers still weighed 21 kilograms, which was mostly underpants and whiskey. Look, we've already established that preparation isn't my forte. But this leads me to tip number 4, which I learned before setting off. I trained for 6 months by putting weights in my panniers for my commute to work. The bike is a 2002 Orbit Harrier with side pull brakes. We all know the principle. Rubber brake blocks press against the wheel rims and friction slows the bike down. With time, the rubber wears down and the blocks need replacing. What I hadn't understood well enough until this trip is that friction works both ways, and that just as the rubber wears down over months, the aluminium of your wheel rim also wears down over years, and the heavier the bike and its load, I'm 6'4", the more pronounced this erosion. My bike mechanic informed me that had it continued, the rims would have thinned and exploded, and my wheel would have suffered a total catastrophic failure. Tip 4. If you haven't got disc brakes, check your wheel rims. The journey proper starts at Oberalp Pass, and I don't think I pedalled for the first 15 kilometres. That's the fun bit. Not so much fun is the absence of dedicated cycle paths, and the worst part for this coincides with the most spectacular views of all EuroVelo 15. Ruina Alta has been called Europe's Grand Canyon. It was formed by a rock slide 10,000 years ago when 12 cubic kilometres of rock went for a walk. I'm unsure which was more exhilarating, the view into the gorge from 500 metres up, or meeting an oncoming juggernaut down a dark one-vehicle tunnel. I can't claim to be a fan of the town Chur. My friend who works at the UN in Vienna tells me that to pronounce it properly you need to sound like you're clearing something repellent from the back of your throat. It's an army town full of young men with semi-automatic rifles, and the sound of gunfire from the local ranges. Surely if there's one army in the world who could do without firearms and defend themselves with, I don't know, knives, surely it's the Swiss army? North of Chur is where Heidi was set, and they call it Heidiland. It's all vineyards and cowbells. Further on, Vaduz in Liechtenstein is lovely, but bear in mind the population has the highest income per capita in the world. If you've seen the James Bond movie Quantum of Solace, you'll recognise the Seebühne at Bregenz. It's the opera stage on the shore of Lake Constance, or the Bodensee, and the productions are famous for their surrealist sets, huge clown heads or a massive single eye. During lockdown, I've been working in my kitchen, but I'm often to be caught looking wistfully at the webcam footage from the town of Lindau on the north shore of the Bodensee, out across the lake and over to the Alps. It's a magical place. Look up in fine weather and you'll more than likely see zeppelins. Not just airships, actual zeppelins. Friedrichshafen is still home to the Zeppelin Company, and the museum has a mock-up of the Hindenburg passenger quarters for you to walk around. Would you believe it had a Rauchzimmer? A smoking room? These days they're building the European Space Agency's next Jupiter probe. Oh, the humanity. It's a ferry ride south to Constance. From here on, huge black-on-white kilometre markers tell you how far downriver you are from Constance Bridge. Those markers become the cycle tourist's friend over the next week or so. It's funny how when consulting a map at home you think some parts are going to be boring, and the stretch between Constance and Basel seemed nondescript. In fact, this was my favourite part. It's mostly flat, easy, scenic, and every now and again throws up an unexpected marvel. Steiner Marine is a medieval town with bright frescoes painted onto buildings. I discovered it by accident. Similarly, I put a pin in a map and booked a guest house in Neuhausen, totally unaware that this was the home to the largest waterfall in Europe. For this stretch, you're constantly crossing the border between Switzerland and Germany, as my phone kept alerting me. I've no idea how they've closed it for lockdown, seeing as some checkpoints are just lone unmanned barriers in the middle of a forest. There's even a bona fide enclave just before Schaffhausen. Büsingen am Hochrhein is a tiny piece of Germany totally surrounded by Switzerland. Tip number 5. If you can, go off-season. This was October and the combine harvesters were still out reaping wheat. It was 32 degrees C and I got sunburned. It only rained twice in 3 weeks. That said, I took a water bottle and hardly used it. And on the subject of hydration, well, how best to put this? I'm a bloke in his mid-50s. In autumn, there are fewer people, so more opportunities for that clandestine pee. Off-season also means that I had the whole dormitory to myself in hostels. The only disadvantage was in Holland, where the authorities perform maintenance on the polders and dikes, meaning that sometimes I'd be diverted from the bike path. 2 things to do in Basel: eat raclette and buy a Vickel fish. The former is an indulgent cheesy cousin to fondue, and the latter is a waterproof bag for your valuables that you take with you out into the river. It's not so much swimming as being carried by the current. There's an allocated safe lane, which doesn't make the passing of coal barges in the next lane any less terrifying. I managed to get lost leaving Basel, so missed the triangular border between Germany, Switzerland and France. However, this brings me to tip 6. Don't become too dependent on your phone data. I'm not going to name names, but a certain phone provider, whose name is an anagram of TB, has consistently failed to fulfill its contract to provide me with data in certain European countries, and France was one of them. A combination of no map on my phone and an unexpected canal took me 30 kilometres off course. The solution was simply to stay on the German side once I'd found it again. Like a Blanche Dubois in Lycra, I do rely on the kindness of strangers on these trips. With just one exception, everyone I spoke to was helpful and friendly. However, there is a special place in hell reserved for one particular hotel receptionist in Germersheim, just south of Speyer. I'll say no more. Mannheim is home to the largest chemical plant in Europe. You're allowed to go swimming and fish downriver of it, but I can't say I was tempted. The range of bikes was huge. Tandems where the front is a recliner, bikes with scoops on the front or side saddle on the back, large enough to take an adult. I quickly got used to dogs as passengers, but the prize for riskiest behaviour has to be split between the girl slumped forward as though for aerodynamics, who was busily texting with both thumbs, and the woman riding one-handed, while the other hand held her newborn baby to her chest. I cannot confirm with absolute certainty that she was wearing a harness. Now we're entering the tourist trap. The second most popular destination in Germany for foreigners is Rüdesheim, and its epicenter is Drosselgasse, a sort of Diagon alley where they ply you with coffee and brandy. North of that is the Mäuseturm, which has a great legend about a greedy bishop and vengeful mice. Further down is the Lorelei, which is basically a big rock. Then the castles of Liebenstein and Sternberg, where the legend of two feuding brothers sounds like a rejected EastEnders plotline. Deutsches Eck in Koblenz is where the Mosel and Rhine meet. Eck means corner in German. The German word for flowers is Blumen, and there is a florist in Vienna called Blumeneck. If you're into your military history, this river is totemic. Every major European conflict since the Romans has regarded crossing the Rhine as a major hurdle. Perhaps this is never more true than at Remagen, where the capture of Ludendorff Bridge may have shortened World War II by months. If you want a feel for the stretch between Bonn and Düsseldorf, I suggest you watch the video for the Chemical Brothers track Star Guitar. It gets very industrial. Be advised that the Chocolate Museum and factory in Köln has no Oompa Loompas. After a frustrating and rainy day in industrial Duisburg, I hit a curb and fell off. I was fortunate. It was just scrapes and bruising, but here's top tip number 7. Don't push it. If you're tired and wet and fed up, you will make mistakes that could end your holiday there and then. Give yourself a break. Ever wondered where Anne of Cleves came from? It was Claver in Germany. Claver is also famous for a nuclear power plant that never was. In the 1970s, the West Germans poured billions of Deutschmarks into a new fast-breeder reactor. It got delayed, and then Chernobyl happened and the whole project was scrapped, except that they still had the cooling towers and the major buildings. So a Dutch guy bought it and turned it into Kernys Familienpark, a sort of atomic Alton Towers. Kern is German for nuclear. Watch out for the border into Holland at Millingen an der Rhein. I sailed past it and didn't realise I was in the Netherlands until all the shop names looked like minor characters in Game of Thrones. Also have €5 ready to bribe the ferry captain, not to wait 2 hours for the next scheduled crossing, but to take you there and then. The cycling rush hour in Arnhem is a test of nerve. A solid block of nose-to-tail bikes moving at speed while scooters in the opposite direction play chicken as they overtake and swing into your lane. And in the middle of all this, the school kids to your right start pulling wheelies. My favourite stop in Holland was the gorgeous little town of Schoonhoven. I've never been able to pronounce it correctly, which made its money in the silver trade. Order a huge plate of garlic king prawns at the Cafeteria Brasserie down at the riverfront and watch the sunset over the barges. Then as you head to your accommodation, listen out for the carillon in the town centre. Again, magical. Officially, the trip finishes at the end of a 2-kilometre pier at Hoek van Holland. You're not supposed to cycle down it, but I did. If you're taking the whole ferry, it's on the other side of the harbour. To ride this adds an extra 30 kilometres. Don't bother. There's a small local ferry that'll take you across. Last tip. Treat yourself to a posher room on the ferry home for 2 reasons. The first is you've earned it. The second is that P&O allow you to change the return date free if you need to. I came home a day early and it didn't cost anything more. That's it, really. Remember, be safe, be considerate, have fun. It is your holiday after all. And if someone as inept as me can do it, so can you.
Bloomin' heck, that was excellent. Thanks, Simon. I'm desperate to know what happened at the hotel reception in Germersheim in Germany. Perhaps we'll never know. Perhaps we don't want to know. What happens in Germersheim stays in Germersheim. If you're interested in recording your own monologue for the podcast, please get in touch. You can email podcast@cyclingeurope.org or find us on Twitter and Instagram @cyclingeurope or on Facebook by visiting the Cycling Europe with Andrew P. Sykes Facebook page. If you didn't write any of that down or were dozing off to sleep when I just said it, visit cyclingeurope.org and click on the Contact button at the top of the page. Creating your own monologue is easier than you might think. It could be about a European country in which you've cycled or in which you live, or it could be about a route that you've travelled along. Why not give it a go? Back to my conversation with Tim, George and Juniper and those diaries that Varnum Parish wrote back in 1908. Can you tell me about the discovery of these diaries that Varnum wrote? Did you always know that they existed, or was it kind of an Indiana Jones moment where you opened a trunk and suddenly realized that there was a document here from the beginning of the 20th century which actually told quite an interesting tale?
I feel like memories are difficult. Sometimes they're not as secure as we think they are and accurate as we think they are. But I believe I recall my mom having mentioned that her great-grandfather did a great trip in Europe cycling. My mom was very close to my great-grandfather, as were a number of my aunts and uncles. But I didn't really see and get access to the diaries, I believe, if my memory serves, until after my grandmother died, Varnum's daughter, or one of his daughters. And then I don't think I read them until quite a number of years later. So it was really a gradual process, certainly was not all at once. And then, just kind of progressing through, eventually found in among other inherited items after my mom passed away, Max's book. And given that Max's name was changed from Jurashek to St. George, that wasn't entirely clear that it was the same person until I kind of made several connections. And that's ultimately how I ended up, going through the book, finding Andrew's site and meeting ultimately Tim and George.
And you're in the process of transcribing the diaries. Can you just actually describe what they look like? Presumably they're handwritten.
Yeah, they're cursive, fountain pen. I think they have a linen cover on paper diaries. The first ones fold kind of long ways vertically. The later ones fold laterally like a book as opposed to a notepad. Yeah, just paper, fountain pen.
And how do they read? Are they pretty factual, like Max's book is pretty factual? Does he express any emotion, any opinions in there?
They are certainly factual, and they're pretty systematized in terms of starting with the date in a typical format and indentation, talking about the number of miles he rode and the weather. So he does certainly have a log aspect to it, and he reflects on and notices a lot of aspects in a very regular way, including the agricultural aspects and cultural and art and history. They're not exceedingly emotive, but he clearly does have a perspective, and he shares his interest and curiosity and kind of remarks upon the differences. I think it's a different time and culture, but he's not really talking about his emotions and how things affect him internally. But he clearly has a perspective, so it's not just a completely dry description.
The two themes that struck me when I first read Max's book, I'm quite happy to be shot down for saying something that I shouldn't, but there are two key themes in Max's book, and they are the Catholic Church and the fact that he basically wanders around or cycles around Europe almost expecting people involved in the Catholic Church to accommodate him. And the other key theme is beer. He seems to like his beer. Wherever he goes, he likes to have a good drinking session. Are those reflected in Varnum's diaries as well?
I think especially when Varnum and Max are together, there is some drinking, but I wouldn't say that it's a major emphasis.
Tim?
I was just going to say a part of it too, I think they both went to Notre Dame, so I think they shared that Catholic aspect of the trip. And so I don't think Varnum probably didn't feel out of place being taken care of by priests and so on. It was interesting that they went to a wedding or something in Poland, and apparently there was a lot of dancing, and Varnum was talking about the endless twirling and spinning around, and that coincided pretty well with what Maximilian said, although he seemed to stay longer at the party and maybe enjoyed it a little bit more than Varnum. But the other I think dynamic between the two that's interesting is the whole money issue. The title of the book has 50 cents a day on there. And I think, George, you would agree that Grandpa St. George was very well known to be very tight, very frugal man. That kind of drove my mother crazy, actually, counting how many tabs of butter you put on your plate. But I didn't get the sense from Varnum that he was quite as concerned about the cost of everything as much, although he did talk about prices and things. What do you think, Juniper?
I think that's right. I also note that in the diaries, before Varnum meets Max, he's mostly staying in hotels. And I think it's really once they get together that they start. It's also, to be fair, earlier in Varnum's voyage, before he meets Max, he's in bigger cities. It's not really practical to do the sorts of things they're doing in small communities, in larger communities. So I think you're right. Varnum pays attention to the costs and writes them down. I think he's always seems to be amazed at how cheap things are in Europe and how many poor people there are and how much less agricultural mechanism there is. So, there's some of those perspectives. But I think certainly once they're together, they're doing a lot more of the, if you will, sort of couch surfing approach. I think you're right.
Yeah.
Well, my impression is it's not that different from the American Midwest or Texas, at least until maybe the last couple of decades, where if someone came by and needed a place to stay, if you had some, you would do it. I mean, people were just very open and giving. I don't think that it's necessarily a European trait, but it's certainly, or maybe it's just because of all the Europeans who moved to Central Texas and other places in the Midwest, but it was far more commonplace even in America than it is today.
I think it's also fair to say regarding the alcohol, regarding the beer, in Max's defense, drinking beer was probably a lot less risky than drinking water in early 20th century Europe, because at least it was alcohol, and the alcohol would presumably have killed potential diseases that he could have picked up by drinking a lot of water. So I'll give him that. I'll give him that.
And he needed the carbs, right? We're riding that much.
Juniper?
I think, that's a good perspective that, that may be a safe way. Max does specifically mention in Spain that the water isn't safe to drink. And there are other places where he mentions, I think actually one of Max's relatives, Varnum, I believe in Varnum's diaries, he's talking about how they have a giant pool of manure within 20 feet of their well, which Varnum wasn't really very excited about in terms of sanitation.
We've talked about what happened to Max when he came back to America. He obviously went on and he continued his life as a lawyer. What did Varnum do?
He was also a lawyer. They had a family bank, the parish bank in Moments. So he was involved with the family bank, with legal services. And he had land, lived on an island, with a bridge to the island, on a beautiful house that my great aunt lived in when I was young, that I remember, and has been in the family until recently. He had the option, I understand, to, kind of go join a big law firm in Chicago, but chose more of a rural life. And many of my aunts and uncles remember him loving to ride the horse. And my mom grew up on a horse with my great grandfather kind of out there all the time. So, he did a lot of pro bono work. I understand that there's a community nearby that was the terminus of the Underground Railroad. And I understand that he did pro bono work for people in that community, that, predominantly Black community that was lower income. Supposedly there was an obituary from that community when he died that was very favorable. Yeah, so he lived, I think, a relatively simple, small town life in some ways.
Okay, so we're talking about two people here that, well, apart from George for 3 years, none of us have met to any extent. George and Tim, if you met him today, do you think you'd actually get on with him? What kind of impression do you get of him?
I guess it would depend on what part of his life we met him. For instance, if he were 120 today, he probably wouldn't get along very well. But if, like, right out of college or when he was making the trips through Europe, I think we'd probably get along fine. In his later life, he was, like I said, he was more severe. Though I wanted to touch back a little bit something when, I think if someone sees Tim and me, they can see my dad in that. And from knowing my dad, I think I can see some of my grandfather in that. And talked about the Catholicism and the enjoyment of an alcoholic beverage. I mean, my dad was definitely a social person. He wouldn't go hit bars or anything, but with the neighbors, there was always cocktails and nice, just friendly times to get together. And I think probably grandfather was like that when he was younger.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say that I'm not religious in the least, but if I had to choose a religion to adopt, it would be the Catholic religion or the Catholic take on Christianity, because they're the ones who seem to have the most fun. So perhaps you're right there. Tim, do you think you would have got on well with Max?
I do. I think I've traveled a lot in my life, mostly work related, but also my wife being Japanese. So we have a house in Japan. So we really like to travel. She's a flight attendant. She's just coming back today actually from a trip. So the idea of the whole wanderlust and, I think very adventurous, to get on a bike and people were just astonished when, he did that, how many years ago. I think that part of him sounds like we would have a lot to talk about. And it's interesting because my son, Max, seems to have very similar leanings. He really, wants to travel. He's got a Fulbright. He's going to be going to Malaysia once the pandemic's over. He had gotten into the Peace Corps, but that got canceled. He was going to go to Sierra Leone for that. So I just think that there is some sort of a strain in our DNA that likes to travel, and I think that would have been a great way to contact each other.
Juniper?
I feel like I would get along very well with him. From everything I hear from all the relatives I've spoken to and the impressions and frankly, when I read his diaries, there's definitely kind of a cognitive familiarity to the way he thinks and his organization and curiosity, the way he looks at things. So I think from everything I understand from family, he really taught the children and grandchildren, and they all had a nice relationship with him. So I think he's someone I think I would get along with very well.
If they were to do this trip in 2021, they would be kind of social media stars. They'd be on Instagram, they'd be on Twitter, they'd probably have a blog to write, and there'd be YouTube videos, etc. Do you think that that's actually correct?
I think it depends on the approach. So I think there are a lot of people who do things without publicizing it. Social media work is work, and some people choose not to do that.
Well, perhaps they could get sponsored by the Catholic Church and a beer company. Perhaps Budweiser would have offered them some free beer in every bar they went to in Europe. Tim, George, any thoughts on that?
I'm not big on social media myself. You can't find me on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter or anything. LinkedIn is my social media. But I guess it would depend, again. Sure, they probably enjoy themselves. Would you want to be known as the guy traveling through Europe on these days? I guess you said it would be like about $15 a day, sleeping in barns and stuff. That might be entertaining. It might be embarrassing. I don't know.
In my neighborhood here, there's a lot of bicyclers, a lot of people, a lot of the guys in the neighborhood, get on their bikes, and they do some pretty long rides too. I mean, through Iowa or something, like 700 miles And so when I brought the story to their attention, they're like, what kind of a bike did he have? How could he possibly have gone 15,000 miles? And I did read something in there about he had 2 speeds, it sounded like. I don't know anything about bikes. So I was actually going to ask you, Andrew, or Juniper. It must have been technologically much more advanced than what Europeans were used to.
Well, if you look at the picture, he's on like a 20 by 100 gear set. It's crazy big gears that he was pushing. But I actually came across, it's like a database that's got some documents from a trade show in 1908. May have been in London. I'd have to look it up. But there were bikes that they said they were, track bikes that were 18 pounds. So there were bikes that were not astoundingly heavy that are pretty close to, a reasonable bike weight now. I think the gearing was a big challenge. And clearly Max had issues with brakes and, there were other challenges, but I think that style of bike was reasonably well developed at that point, and the weight wasn't that astronomical.
The bikes that were around at the time, and this does get referenced in the original podcast, they were a world away from what we know now. I think most people cycling nowadays would struggle to use one of the bikes that they did have. The Tour de France, which I think it started for the first time in 1906, I think, around that time. They had wheels that they actually, in order to change the gear, they removed the back wheel and turned it round because it had a different size cog on one side compared to the other. So in effect, they were just two-speed bicycles, and they did thousands of kilometers around France. But that was a real hardcore trip at the time. It's kind of almost, it's very, very different nowadays. They're cosseted and they stay in hotels, and they have their bikes mended every evening and washed, etc. So I would imagine if we were to get on the bikes that they used, and there were a few bikes because they lost them, they had them broken, so they were replaced a few times. I think most of us would probably recoil in horror at the thought of having to cycle down to the supermarket, let alone 16,000 miles around Europe.
There are some people who did do a stage of the early Tour de France on vintage bikes. They were also bikes that were 100 years old. So when they were new, presumably the bearings were in better shape than after 100 years. But certainly challenging, but I think less challenging than I think one might expect for a device built that long ago.
Personally, I would not like to do it on the kind of bike that they were doing. I'm quite happy with my modern roll-off hub bike, crawling up a steep hill very slowly, but equally has me speeding along on the flat at high speed. So yeah. Just to finish with, the legacy of these two people, of Max and Varnum. George, Tim, do you think there's any way of making sure that the memory of your grandfather doesn't just fade into the obscurity of time?
Well, partially, we have you to thank for that. I have a friend that I met years ago, haven't been in touch with her for a while, but she had a website with something like Czechs, Poles, and Moravians, oh my, and she talked about all the different Europeans in the Texas Hill Country. And I thought, well, yeah, you could probably find something about the Jurashiks there. So I'm going to have to get back in touch with her and see if she's done anything recently. She's also a chemist. She works for a company in Houston. That was sort of a sidelight for her, so she may not have even done anything in the last 10 years, but might be a way to pick up a little bit more backstory on the family.
Tim?
I agree with Michael. I think, frankly, what you've done memorialized on your website is head and tails beyond anything I would have thought of. I always thought it was kind of an interesting story, and more reading about it. And I mean, I can't help but to think it seems kind of like an Ian Forster novel or something, or especially the whole riding through Italy and meeting the Countess and the Baroness, whatever. And the book itself, I don't think there's that many copies of it. I was able to nab one off of Amazon. But thank you for your bringing all of this back to light and helping us recollect and pull together our family in Italy at one point and everything. So, yeah.
I think there's perhaps, and I'm only half joking here, I do think there's perhaps scope for a Hollywood film here, because the aspect of him meeting Ape Lucia in Italy, the way in which it's told in those newspaper reports that I talk about in the original podcast, that's a very National Enquirer way of telling that story. And I'm sure Hollywood could do something with the story of him setting off around Europe to cycle and then meeting the love of his life. And then I'm sure they could make some of it up. I think they probably have to. But have you got anybody who you in mind who you might think would be a good person to play Max in the story?
No, I hadn't thought about it. Oh,
well, again, when I think of Granddad, I think of how he looked in his later years. So I think of Terry O'Quinn or something, but probably in his younger days, be more, I don't know, Ryan Reynolds.
Okay, well, if Ryan Reynolds is listening, then he needs to get in touch with you and sort something out. Juniper, you do have plans to continue this story. Can you talk about those?
I've been working, what got me kind of connected with you all was my work towards reproducing Varnum's trip myself. And since I'm a photographer and, would be kind of bringing cameras and taking pictures anyway, my intent is to make a documentary about the trip. And it's still pretty early on in terms of developing the facets that I would emphasize. But I'm working on building a documentary as I reproduce the trip.
Well, I hope that comes to fruition, because I think it would be a fascinating thing to watch. I did once think, and I mapped the route that Max took across the 16,000 miles that he did. And it was such a tortuous backward, forward route that he took. I think you'd just have to be crazy to even attempt it. But I did latch on to the idea that he did visit most of the capital cities of his time. And I think that might be an aspect that somebody perhaps one day might decide to embark upon, trying to visit all the capital cities. The problem now, of course, is that there are far more capital cities in Europe, thanks to the fragmentation after the wars and then post-communism, than there were back in Max's day, where I think there were probably 20, if that. Yeah, that would be a possible idea.
I actually mapped Max's route as well. It seemed like a reasonably direct route to cover all of that territory with to me, but it's a lot of area to cover. So you're going to go a long ways, whichever route you take. I'm considering more really reproducing Varnum's route, which is, certainly a much more limited subset than what Max did.
Well, if any of you ever come to England on your travels, then you're more than welcome to let me know, and I'll come and meet you. Juniper, I hope on your documentary you also go to the extent of not taking a plane or a cruise ship, but I hope you find a cattle ship to take you across the Atlantic.
Well, it's actually something I've researched. I mean, clearly global trade has changed a lot since then, and we're not sending American beef to, Europe. There are container ships, but again, it's like more predominantly Asia as being the hub of global trade. So those routes are different, but that's definitely, on my list of something to attempt to do if possible. I think that's an interesting part of it.
And I definitely think you should do it on a original bicycle.
I don't feel the need to do that. Thank you. I'm not 24.
Well, Andrew, I just want to say that if we do come to visit you, can we crash on your couch?
Yeah, right.
Well, do bear in mind, I'm not a good Catholic because I'm not a Catholic at all. But I do have a good stock of beer.
It's half the job.
Okay, well, thank you all for talking. That's been excellent. It's been really enjoyable to chat. And, hopefully somebody out there will be inspired by the story of Max and Varnum to head off on their own travels. So thank you.
Yeah, thanks for hosting.
Thank you all.
A very big thank you to Tim and George and Juniper for getting in touch with me and then accepting the offer to record a chat for the podcast. Is that the end of the Max and Varnum show? I'm not sure. Inspired by the fact that Max had visited every capital city of his day, with the exception of St. Petersburg and Lisbon, I did plan an outline route that took in every capital city of modern-day Europe. You can see it if you visit cyclingeurope.org/MaxMe. That's Max, M-A-X, me, M-E. And in the summer of 2020, I did make a start by cycling from my home in West Yorkshire to Edinburgh, then Belfast, then Cardiff, then finally London. COVID and the amount of time I had available prevented me from going further, but it could be a long-term project. If I were to continue along the route proposed, my next stops would be Brussels, then Luxembourg, Amsterdam, Berlin, before heading north and east into Scandinavia. Spread over several summers, I could arrive in my final capital, Paris, in 2024 or 2025, or who knows. There's no rush. Watch this space. The Cycling Europe podcast will return very soon with episode 36. Thank you for listening. Happy cycling and stay safe.